Russian forces are currently attacking in eastern Ukraine, specifically focusing on Donetsk Oblast. So we've seen the creeping gains near Avdiivka and then also west and southwest of Donetsk city. So we continue to assess that the Russian offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast continue to be this fixing operation in that area to attempt to draw Ukrainian forces away from the critical sectors in Donetsk Oblast. So, Russian attempts to seize Chasiv Yar, as well as Avdiivka.
And how much progress have Russia been making in Kharkiv Oblast in recent weeks? Has the offensive stalled somewhat?
Yes, so the tempo of Russian offensive operations slowed dramatically at the very beginning. And we've seen within the past week or so that Ukrainian forces have been able to make tactical gains, actually, in the area. But Russian forces did not, the Russian military did not commit, significant Russian forces to the Kharkiv area, suggesting, right, that they don't see it as a prioritized effort, but rather a fixing operation. So the tempo has slowed incredibly there.
I wanted to ask you, Nicole, about events recently in Dagestan, the Russian Republic, of course, and the Caucasus. We're a week on from a major terrorist attack there, and it's the second major terrorist attack in Russia within just 3 months. We remember the attack on the outskirts of Moscow at the concert hall a few months back. How big a worry is internal security and domestic terrorism for Vladimir Putin at the moment?
So it's clear that after the Crocus City Hall attack in March, Russian authorities were definitely worried about increased terrorism, given that they, started to signal to take measures on being more forceful against migrants, as well as they made allusions to, in diplomatic meetings working with Central Asian countries like Tajikistan, specifically to combat different threats from Afghanistan. But while that may be ongoing, clearly because of the attack in Dagestan, Russian security forces haven't been able to completely eradicate that threat, and seem very unwilling in public statements to actually acknowledge that there is a domestic terrorism threat within Russia, because they continue to posture this very stable and normal society, and continually promote the sort of interethnic, interreligious harmony, without recognizing that there is a legitimate Islamist extremist threat within Russia.
And it was interesting after the attack at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow, Putin baselessly asserting that Ukraine had some sort of culpability with no evidence, obviously. Have we seen something similar in the wake of the attack in Dagestan?
So not to the same extent. So obviously we saw, at the highest levels, including Putin, accuse Ukraine baselessly of, committing the Crocus City Hall attack. But for this Dagestan attack, it's much more much more subtle effort. There have been Russian officials who have blamed Ukraine, but not to the same level, of Putin or the cabinet, for example. But there have been efforts to link the two, and for example, tie different events taking place in the war with the attack, simply because they took place during a certain time frame. And so all of these are more subtle attempts to condition, Russian society into linking the war with Dagestan and then inadvertently blaming Ukraine.
And ethnic minorities in regions such as Dagestan have been disproportionately mobilized since the start of the war. Has that added to the tensions there?
So we have seen increasing tension, especially against migrants. And so obviously these are usually people from the South Caucasus and Central Asia coming to work in Russia. And these are not Russian citizens, although they do sometimes get Russian citizenship. But what we've seen now, and these people often get criticized and discriminated against, but what we've seen now is this shift of these Russian ultranationalists that support the war lumping together Russian citizens who are Muslim with these migrants. So now they're starting to blur the lines of who they see as a threat of indigenous Russian ethnic minorities who happen to be Muslim, and now are lumping them in with who they deem as threats of migrants.
And were the tensions in the Caucasus to spill over again, as we've seen over the years in places like Chechnya and other places? How much of an internal concern is that for Putin, and could that potentially undermine his war effort in Ukraine?
I think that's a very hard question, and we have seen that specifically, Chechen leader Kadyrov has been helping in the war effort since the start, and has been leveraged for mobilization efforts, and also his forces have been participating in the war. So increased tension could definitely threaten the internal situation in Russia at a time when Russia needs unity behind this war effort.
This is probably hard to answer, but I'll just ask you, just in case you're in a position to comment on it. There was speculation a few months ago that Kadyrov was seriously ill and may not be around for too much longer. And if he's out of the equation, what does that mean for the region, in particular in Chechnya? Do you know anything on that?
We've seen multiple times speculation of Kadyrov's health. So speculations within the Russian information space regarding his well-being are frequent, and certain actors like to, in the information space, really are just sort of conspiratorial about the whole thing. But it is, we continue to monitor who Kadyrov is trying to elevate to his successor. As in recent days, it's recent months, it's been more unclear which of his older sons he's interested in promoting.
In the ISW's latest campaign assessment, you talk about Vladimir Putin's theory of victory being based on Russia making creeping advances in Ukraine almost indefinitely. Can you just expand a bit on that for us?
Sure. So Putin articulated this theory of victory in early June at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And so he assessed basically that Russian forces will be able to continue gradual creeping advances indefinitely, likely at the current tempo of operations, and this would prevent Ukraine from conducting any sort of significant, successful counteroffensive operations, and that through this slow creeping advances and war of attrition, Russia could eventually be victorious in Ukraine.
That's interesting, because we do often hear talk about Putin almost wanting to create a forever war in Ukraine. Is this almost part of that?
So I think there's a couple different aspects here. So he wants to protract the war because protracting the war would likely give Russia the time to reconstitute, rest its forces, continue to mobilize its defense industrial base. So it's continuing these creeping advances to do that, as well as to also maintain the initiative. So Putin has likely assessed that it's imperative for Russian forces to maintain the initiative on the battlefield and throughout the theater in order to prevent Ukrainian forces from making any sort of advances or conduct any sort of operationally significant counteroffensive. So this protraction of the war would help that, but at the same time, Putin has falsely signaled interest in negotiating a ceasefire. Currently, he is not interested in this, but ISW continues to assess that such a ceasefire would also in a way protract the war, because it wouldn't end it, and it would establish the further precedent for Russia to use this time to reconstitute, build up its defense industrial base, to then in the future, pursue the destruction of Ukraine.
And is also one of his incentives when it comes to protracting this war the hope that if it drags on, Western support for Ukraine will begin to drop off?
Absolutely. So this whole assumption is based on the idea that Putin and Russia can outlast Western resolve. So, Western political, military, security support for Ukraine.
And can they outlast it? I mean, speaking now, obviously they're trying to build up their military industrial base in Russia, but maybe from an economic point of view as well, can Russia outlast the West? Has it got the capacity to keep this war dragging on for years and years and years?
So Putin has signaled some economic reforms recently, including adjusting the tax codes, and part of this is likely to more easily integrate the economy with the Russian war effort. So he is taking these steps to better have the Russian economy serve the Russian war effort, likely in an effort to attempt to maintain the protracted war.
That's really interesting. Just tell us a bit more about the changes he's made to tax. Has he increased taxes, or has he just sort of done a bit of, changes around the edges that increase revenue?
So he has suggested a more graduated tax system for Russians over a certain income, and the Russian government has suggested that this would increase revenue, as well as there's also like an informational aspect of this, of course, because it's only for people over a certain income, right? This is also an effort to kind of include more people into this war effort. So kind of signaling that everyone in society must take on this burden.
There's surely a risk there, though. If you are making people quite literally pay for your war in Ukraine and pay more for your war in Ukraine, presumably there are internal political risks for Putin by doing that.
Of course, but I think at this current time, the changes aren't drastic enough to see incredible pushback against that. And we have seen that the Russian elites and oligarchs have largely fallen behind Putin and come to heel in supporting the war, or at least not outwardly expressing criticism of it.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.